Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Good Deeds Note Investing Podcast. I am your co-host, Jamie Bateman, and today I'm actually going to be flipping seats, if you will, here, and I'll be the guest on the show. And today we have Katie Berlin as the I guess temporary host, if you will. And Katie recently joined our team at Labrador Lending, and she helps us with some marketing and branding, and who knows where that'll go. But we're really happy to have Katie as part of our team at Labrador Lending. And we thought today we take the opportunity for Katie, who is a little bit less familiar with note investing than many of us are, for her to ask me kind of questions from a newbie's perspective. Some back to basics questions, if you will. So Katie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the intro. And yes, for the audience, as Jamie mentioned, I am definitely a newbie in this space. So even though I've started working with Jamie recently, I have a lot to learn. I'm a little bit familiar with real estate investing, but these questions as a newbie note investor are really going to be because I am a newbie. And I haven't invested in notes yet. So this is really like your 101, back to basics.
Yep, absolutely. We don't have to fake anything here.
Yeah, Jamie will pour the knowledge out and we will consume it because I will be learning right along with everyone else.
Now, am I paying you for this time?
It is. So for the audience, this is Saturday morning. This is triple time, basically.
Triple time.
Yeah,
oh man,
yeah.
I did not read the fine print on the contract. Yeah, Katie's out in California. I'm in Maryland, so I guess it's not overly early for you, but it's still earlier for you than it is for me. So I
do wake up before noon, contrary to what some people may believe about us out here in LA. Yes.
Slackers, always behind.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll be quiet until you ask me questions. You're now the host. We don't need Chris anymore. He's frolicking around in the U.S. Virgin Islands or something. So yeah, what do you want to know about notes?
All right, so let's begin with really going back to the basics of what is a note? How would you explain this to someone who has never even heard this term before, or maybe is familiar with something like a note, but doesn't understand it in the world of real estate investing?
Sure. So in its most basic form, a note is a promise to pay. And so this can take on many other forms. We'll try to keep it focused. Like you said, real estate. So most people are familiar with a mortgage, taking out a loan to buy a house, right? So in our world, when we say note or note investing, it's typically a first position. It could be second position, but a note is a promise to pay. So I go into a bank, I get a mortgage to buy a house. The bank gives me $250,000 and I promise to pay that back over time, typically monthly installments and with interest. So that's the promise to pay. The note is actually a document. It's really pretty simple, and it's normally 2 to 4 pages. There's not much to it really. It spells out the terms of the promise to pay, and so that note itself in our world is attached to collateral, which is the real estate. And that's where people argue, is note investing real estate part of real estate investing, or is it a separate niche? It doesn't really matter. I think it is, but it's kind of its own little niche. But that the note is actually attached to the property by a mortgage or deed of trust, depending on the state. But to more succinctly answer your question, a note is a promise to pay. And in the real estate space, a note is backed by the hard real estate. So if I don't pay the bank back, the bank can take that property from me.
Now, you mentioned a couple terms, and I want to get into acronyms as well. But you mentioned a couple terms that some people may not be familiar with. So you said first position
Yeah.
or second position. What do those mean and how do they relate in
Yeah.
very, simplistic terms to
So
this?
first position is also referred to as first lien. So, and second position, second lien. So the bank, when the bank lends me money as a borrower to buy a house, they take on first position if there are no other mortgages or liens on the property. So um, basically that just means that the bank has a right to collect their money, and if not, they have a right to that up to that amount that I owe them. And so they first lien or first position means that that mortgage or that note, if you will, has the first right to all of their money back. And so normally that's dictated by the order that that the note was actually recorded. So let's just, like you said, keep it simple. Walk into a bank, $250,000 loan from the bank to go buy my new home. That bank will then record that mortgage or deed of trust that shows that they are in first position. So if I then go and take out say a HELOC or a second mortgage, another loan on that property that I live in, that new lender, it could be the same bank, but that second loan is now in second position. So there's more risk there. So let's say the house is worth 300,000. I took out a first position mortgage for 250,000. Let's say I go get another small line of credit for 20,000. Well, that line of credit is going to have a higher interest rate, most likely, because there's higher risk for that second lender. They don't have as strong a position as that first lender. That first lender has the right to collect their whole $250,000 before the second lender gets anything. So it's normally dictated by how the order that the loans were actually recorded. But that's kind of in somewhat simplistic terms what a first and second position mortgage or deed of trust are.
In a way, then, if you are a note investor, you are almost acting like the bank.
Correct. Absolutely. And so you'll hear people or see people disagree over whether you're actually a lender if you are originating the loan or not. You can get into all kinds of semantics in this space, but you absolutely are acting as the bank or the lender when you purchase a note that was already originated. So that's the world that we operate in. We don't originate notes. So I'm not underwriting a new borrower to see if I will lend them money. Someone else has already done that. And that's typically a bank. It could be a seller financed transaction or lender. So that's kind of, I guess, the nuance where, some people would argue we're not the bank because we didn't underwrite them. We didn't actually originate this loan and lend them the money. That was already done. But in many, many ways, we take on all the rights that the original lender or bank had at that time. Yes.
And how does that work? Because when you think about a bank or you think about like a typical lender, they're usually insured, like FDIC insured, or have some sort of other means to back up if they're licensed. There could be these other factors that allow them to do that. So if you're a note investor, is there anything special that you have to do to be able to take on that risk?
So there are state by state requirements to be a note investor, but in general, it's a largely unregulated space, frankly. I don't think most people anticipated as many note investors as there are. And after up before 2008, 2009, I don't think there had been such an influx of non-performing loans, and we can get into that later. But so I don't know that too many people foresaw this situation where we have all these note investors and oftentimes the law and legislation are behind reality or the free market, I guess. But I'm not a bank. I don't have to follow the banking regulations. Banks also are able to do other things. They can get into fractional reserve lending, where they can actually lend money that they don't have, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. But I can't do that. I can't lend money that I don't have. And so they have to follow certain regulations that we don't have to follow. But there are specific. So the NMLS is a site to check out if you want to research licensing for note investors. In most states, you can operate without any kind of debt collector license. But I do recommend people use a licensed servicer if they're buying notes that are for owner-occupied properties. So that's when you get into Dodd-Frank and CFPB requirements, and there are more strings attached when you're operating in the owner-occupied space, which is where we operate primarily. If you're dealing with fix and flip notes or credit card loans or the auto loans or something like that, that's a whole separate animal. But in general, there aren't too many requirements as far as licensing goes, or red tape, if you will.
So if it's just me and I'm just like, Joe Schmo over here, I don't really know anything, I could log on to the NMLS,
right?
Try to find a note, and just, if I have capital, I can be like, okay, I'm gonna purchase this.
Yes, I mean yes, I mean, I always seek legal advice. I'm not an attorney. Katie's not an attorney, but absolutely.
You cannot tell by my questions that I'm not an attorney.
No. The NMLS, just to clarify, I don't think you meant this and you didn't say this, but definitely check the NMLS. That's not a source for loans, for notes, but that will give you state-by-state requirements to be so it really does vary. This is one thing that a lot of new note investors kind of underestimate, I think, is how much this being a note investor can vary based on the state. And that's another thing that people ask often is, well, I'm in California, what do I need to, what requirements are there for me? Well, it really isn't about where you are. It's about where that house, that property is, where that note is actually located. So if I'm going to buy a loan in Georgia, so technically you need a lender license in Georgia to buy a note. Now, you will get varying opinions on this based on the legal feedback I've gotten. I've been told, don't purchase any notes in Georgia, for example, on owner-occupied properties without a lender license. So we went and got our lender license, which did require a good chunk of change. It's not cheap, but it does, I think, separate us. And Chris has his lender license as well in Georgia. So it's just, to me, it makes more sense. There aren't that many legal requirements in this space, so why not just comply with the ones that do exist?
So if you are brand new, you don't necessarily know where to begin.
Right.
And you're interested in, all right, how do I begin to research? Now, you mentioned owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. If you're a newbie and you're trying to figure out, where do I even begin? What would be right for me? Is there a place that you recommend, like, okay, start here, like think about yourself and what your goals are and begin to look at it from this lens?
Obviously, you should go to our website, labradorlending.com. You teed that one up for me. We do have a free ebook and a lot of other resources. Chris has a ton of resources on his site. Go back and listen to all of our previous episodes. But it's not, this note space is all about networking and just asking questions. it's a little bit murky as far as, it's not a clearly laid out path for you, but that's one of the things I love about it is you can make it what you want. So I do think most people, at least in the note space that we run in, most people operate in the owner occupied world, if you will. So that we have had some guests on our show that buy more fix and flip loans and do commercial loans and things like that. Those tend to be more lumpy and more active, meaning like a fix and flip loan. If you think about it, a normal rehabber is trying to get this property fixed up within 6 months, let's just say, versus an owner occupied property. I think the average time that people, refinance or move is closer to 7 years, something like that. So, and so whether you should play in the owner occupied space or not, some of it will come down to deal flow as well. And right now, deal flow has been challenging for a lot of people. There just aren't as many notes floating around as maybe there were 5-6 years ago. So you might think, oh yeah, I'll get into the fix and flip space as a note investor. But if there are more owner occupied notes available, you might kind of just go that route. So I think it's not, normally speaking, most people end up going down the owner occupied space. Another path, I guess, another key difference between the owner occupied and fix and flip or commercial space is that you have a much better chance of working out. If you're buying non-performing loans, you have a much better chance of exiting through the borrower on the owner occupied side, because oftentimes they want to keep their home. They don't want to be kicked out of their home. If you're operating in the fix and flip note space, you have a higher chance of exiting through the property, meaning you're going to get that property back. So again, that's more non-performing owner occupied versus non-performing fix and flip. So if you're somebody who's trying to work with borrowers and you want to keep them in their homes and you prefer to exit through the borrower than versus the property, the owner occupied side is probably more for you. There are all kinds of strategies, performing versus non-performing, partials, joint ventures, and things like that, but trying to keep it somewhat basic here. So hopefully that answered that question.
Well, I also want to talk on the strategy piece, because if you think about investments in general, many people think about, okay, I want to invest in something. Their considerations are, how much money will that take? How much time will that take? And how much knowledge will that take? So it's one thing, like, for example, if I use the stock market as an example, let's say that you have your 401k and you're going to invest in the stock market, and you really are not familiar with individual stocks. So you just choose an index fund that's close to when you'll retire. Very passive.
Yeah.
You're not in there every day, like, let me leverage each of these little, pieces of this puzzle to try to get ahead of where the market's performing. You're just like, you know what? I'm at my job every day. I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm sticking my money in an index fund. When it comes to note investing, you could probably look at it in the same way. Do you want to be active? Like, I'm putting quotations here, air quotes, active, or do you want to be, quotations, passive? So if you're a newbie, like if you were someone like me and I'm trying to think about my strategy, okay, I have my day job, I'm part-time real estate investing. How do I even begin this? Do I think about my strategy of maybe I need to partner up with someone who knows more about this than I do?
Yeah.
Where, is that, can I leverage that person as a resource to learn this? How do I know if I should be active or passive? So I'd love for you to put some framework around that for someone who is like, where will I even begin?
Now I have, I think I did a short YouTube video on the 5 key questions for new note investors, and this is definitely one of them. And one of the blog posts that we wrote, Stephen Berkey wrote it, I helped edit it, that we have on our website is probably, it's definitely the most thorough and most informative blog post we have. And it may seem like I'm taking a cop out here, but by pointing people to that instead of answering the question, but that will go into the weeds a lot more than I'm about to. So I just wanted to let people know about that. It's this whole passive active thing. First of all, you may not have everything figured out. Most people don't, let's be real. So like, you don't know what your life is going to look like in 10 years. So on some level, you do need to just kind of roll up your sleeves and test the waters, and, and then pivot. If you're like, you buy a couple notes and then you realize this isn't for me, that's fine too. So don't approach it by thinking, oh, I'm locked in for the next decade on whatever I decide today. That's just a little, my 2 cents on that. With that, all of that said, there's definitely a spectrum of passive to active in the note investing space. So a lot of the gurus out there will sell, the idea that note investing is passive. You just sit back and collect mailbox money, blah, blah, blah. It's so easy. It's not really that easy. And so, Chris and I try to keep it real on the podcast, and it can be, there absolutely are ways to be more passive. Like you're talking about with the index fund, like I have in my TSP, which is the government version of 401k. I've got the life cycle fund, and it just automatically adjusts, from stocks to more bonds, I guess, as I get older. It's extremely passive. I don't know that you're ever going to be quite that passive as a note investor. There are note funds out there. Chris and I have a note fund, and that's probably the most passive way to go, is if you can get into a note fund or maybe buy partials. And again, this is, we're touching on some weeds here, but we're not really like in the weeds yet. So I think if you want to be passive, there's a scale of passive to active. Note funds, super passive, relatively speaking. Performing loans, more passive than non-performing loans. Buying partials, probably even more passive than buying a performing loan yourself. Getting into the non-performing space gets more active. When we say active, you're mostly sitting at a desk with your computer and your phone. So there's a lot going on, especially if you decide to scale and buy more than a handful of notes, but it's not active. It's not physically active. And so it really comes down to, how do you define active? How do you define passive? And what your goals are. So some people do find that there's just too much paperwork and too much you're really like a conductor of an orchestra, where you are having to, if you're scaling on any level and you get into non-performing notes, there are a lot of moving parts. And so you're dealing with attorneys, servicers, vendors, property preservation companies, borrowers, there's, and you got to make sure you've got forced place insurance. So you've got other vendors, property taxes, county, and city personnel. And, that doesn't sound all that passive. So, I rambled a little bit on that answer, but you can make it what you want. You can absolutely buy a performing loan or invest in a note fund through your self-directed IRA, for example, and be pretty darn passive. I have one note I have more than one note, but one of the notes I have in my self-directed IRA, I don't even she just pays every month, and I really don't give it much attention. It's slightly more active than, buying an index fund like you're talking about, but not much. So you can be passive if you want to, but I think if you decide to scale or get into non-performing loans, just forget the whole passive thing, because it's active.
If you decide that this is a direction that you wanted to go as an investor and you wanted to begin to dabble in the space, you've mentioned the partials. And do you feel that partials, I'd love for you to explain what that is. And do you feel like that's kind of like a good gateway in for many people that are just getting their feet wet?
Yeah. And you can structure your partials in different ways. Consult with your attorney. A true partial, I own, let's say I bought a performing loan, and partials work better with performing loans, to be clear. Performing loans, we didn't really, I mentioned the term, but a performing loan is where the borrower is actually paying. So they're in their home, they pay their monthly mortgage payment on time. Honestly, like most people do, but so that's what a performing loan is. It's where the borrower is actually making payments pretty much on time. And so just wanted to clarify that I would not, I would not sell a partial on a non-performing loan. So to walk through a basic example of a partial, let's say Labrador Lending owns a whole note that has a principal balance of $100,000. And let's just say the borrower is making on-time payments of $300 a month, making this up. But if I actually would prefer to take a lump sum of cash and reinvest that into, another note, I could sell you, Katie, a partial, and then you would actually collect those $300 per month payments for the next X number of payments. So let's say I sell you a partial for 3 years. So I bought this note that has a principal balance of $100,000. It's performing. Let's say I bought it for $75,000. I could sell you a partial for the next few years, and you would actually collect those payments, and I would take that lump sum of cash that you just paid me for those payments, and I could go reinvest that elsewhere. So it's a business decision, but buying a partial absolutely can be more passive than buying even a performing loan. So yes, I think it is a very good way for a newer note investor to kind of partner up with the note holder, the note owner, and approach note investing in a more passive way than actually buying a whole loan themselves. Again, there are many ways you can kind of create these. Some people involve their servicer in the partial payments, some people do not. That's really in the weeds, and you can get into hypothecation versus partials, which we have all this on our site as well. But it's definitely I think a really good place to start. If, let's say, you don't have a whole lot of money, or you're not maybe an accredited investor, you can't find a good note fund for non-accredited investors, a partial can be a great way to go to just get exposure to the note world. Buying a partial can be a great way to go to get into the world of note investing without being 100% responsible for everything or familiar with how things work.
So if it was me, and let's say that I was like, okay, this is something that I want to dabble in, and let's say we're using your example of the $100,000 note that that you paid $75,000 for.
Right.
So if it was me and I was like, hey, knock, 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 Jamie, I really am interested in this. I want to invest. From my point of view, I would be looking to pay a certain amount of money out of my pocket. So let's say it's like $10,000 or $20,000, and I would put that $20,000 into this note, and it would really be going to you. You're giving me then like partial ownership over that note, and then every month I'm collecting an agreed upon dollar amount because this note is, quote unquote, as you said, performing, where there's somebody
Correct.
paying that. So I'm receiving that benefit, that dollar benefit every month for the lump sum of cash that I provided to you in exchange.
Exactly. Correct.
And then I'm able to use your knowledge and your resources to then understand, okay, if I come up against this situation, or we collectively are in this situation where maybe I wouldn't know how to proceed on my own if I was just out there, trying to figure this out from the start.
Right.
You might be able to give a little bit of guidance and say, okay, because you have skin in the game versus like me just.
That's exactly right.
Going
So, and this is where, again, people do it differently. I sell my partials where I am still very active, because like you said, I have skin in the game. I don't want to sell you the next 3 years of payments, and then you have no idea what you're doing. No offense. But, and then you
True.
screw things up, and then all of a sudden, you know, the loan is mine after that 3-year period. Well, I still have an interest in this borrower performing in this loan paying. So you're absolutely right. I still have skin in the game. So the way I do my partials, I'm still very active as the partial seller. And yes, you could absolutely rely on the partial seller for information, or you know, you're not going to be calling every day, let's go over this deal together. And, you know, it's like, no, here's access.
Are you sure?
In reality, the way I do it is I give, we use Podio, as you know, and I'll give the partial buyer access to that particular asset so they can see what's going on every day with it. You know, again, someone else might actually do more of a true transfer where, hey, Katie, this is up to you now. And, you know, good luck. I'll talk to you in 3 years. We don't do it that way, but yeah, I mean, and you can also get into joint ventures, which is a separate topic, but joint ventures are a little more together, meaning the big decisions are made together and that kind of thing. The way our partial agreement is written, you know, if the note does go non-performing, there are different exits that you and I could agree on as to how we want to, you know, exit that partial deal. Or if the loan pays off, you know, sometimes the borrower just pays off the loan, and then it's like, wait a minute, now what? You know, so that's all written into the agreement ahead of time. But as the partial buyer, you absolutely are backed up. You still have that same collateral in a sense that I, as the note holder, had originally. So it's one thing about notes is like people say, oh my God, real estate is risky, or note investing is risky. But stocks have no collateral, and it's just, we just assume like, you know, you go get a job and everybody, you know, they sign you up. You have to opt out of the 401k now, and it's like almost forced upon you because that's what you're supposed to do. You know, I've heard the guy that actually created the 401k wrote that part of the code. He never intended it to be this massive tool, or the only tool for retirement. You know, that's a whole rant that I could go on. We have money in stocks. I have a TSP, like I mentioned. I'm not anti-stock market, but I just because you're unfamiliar with notes doesn't make it risky. You need to learn about it, like we're doing here, and then understand it, and then you can actually invest in what you know. So then you can, you know, approach it while you mitigate some of that risk.
I think that's why it can seem a little bit nebulous to people, whereas it seems like, okay, well, what exactly am I investing in? With real estate, you understand I could purchase this house and I can, you know, take a hammer and some nails and fix it up and paint it and rip out the carpet, and I beautify this location. I've created equity in it. A lot of people understand that entire process. When it comes to a note, it seems a little bit more like, okay, well, wait, what exactly? How do you create that? So I'd love for you to talk through, in the example that we gave, where you're saying, let's say, you know, you bought a mortgage that's $100,000 and you bought the note for $75,000.
Yeah.
How exactly that process works, where the person who's living in the home, because you've mentioned owner occupied, how they are involved in making those payments so that the end receiver, which would be, if we're in this together, you and I, are actually making money off of this and it is an investment. Like, break that down.
Yeah, I mean, the way I do try to help people think about it in that vein is that a performing loan like we're talking about is truly more like a buy and hold rental property. So you buy a performing loan for cash flow. Hopefully you can get it at a nice discount when you purchase it, meaning, like we said in our example, $75,000 for a true performing loan is a pretty good price right now, assuming the borrower has, you know, assuming a lot of factors, right? But that, although it doesn't come with, note investing has no inherent tax benefits. And Chris and I have done one episode on 10 reasons to invest in notes and another episode on 10 reasons not to invest in notes, because there's no perfect asset class. And, so go back, I encourage the listeners to go back and listen to those. But buying this performing loan is more like a buy and hold rental property. You're looking for cash flow, really. So leaving the partial out of it for now, I'm just buying this $100,000 loan. Maybe originally it was $120,000, but now the borrower has paid down that principal balance to $100,000. I might be able to purchase that for $75,000. I'm collecting those $300 per month payments, and so it's for cash flow. So you're not going to be able to add a whole lot of value to that deal itself, just like a rental property that you go buy on the retail market through a realtor, on the MLS. You're probably not going to be able to just turn around and sell it in 6 months for way more, because what value did you add there? So a performing loan is more like a buy and hold rental property. Again, there are certain tax benefits to rentals that notes don't have. And then a non-performing loan is more like a fix and flip property. And so there are multiple ways you can exit the deal, and it may take longer. I would, as a new note investor, just assume that any non-performing loan is going to take you 6 months to 2 to 3 years to exit. So it's not quite as quick as a fix and flip may be. But in that example, you're buying it at a larger discount, greater discount, and you're able to add value to the asset itself and then exit at a profit, hopefully. So performing loan is more like a buy and hold rental, and a non-performing loan, I know you didn't specifically ask about that, but is more like a fix and flip property. But when you're buying the note, you're buying the debt. So like you said, you're becoming a lender, becoming the bank. And so, but you still have that collateral, that hard real estate as collateral. So it's backing up the loan. So I do think note investors, or people who are unfamiliar with note investing that have a real estate background, whether that's as a realtor or a real estate investor, fix and flipper, I think that helps for sure. So that's where I'd say it is a niche within real estate investing. But you can absolutely be a software engineer and be really good with Excel and running numbers and be somewhat unfamiliar with real estate and be a successful note investor. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses.
Marketers are also living in Excel, Jamie, so don't leave us out of that. It's not just software engineers.
Yes,
we live in Excel.
You've told me that before.
When I think about the actual exchange of money in this situation, so this is what I want to go back to touch on.
Yeah, because I didn't answer that.
If you have a mortgage and every month you're paying your mortgage, you have your principal balance, and then you have the interest that you're paying. Right. And let's just say, for our example, we're using a $300 a month in this situation. The $300 is covering this principal balance plus the interest.
Right. It might be a little low, but that's the number we went with. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. These are not relative to real life numbers we're talking about here. So in that situation, the note investor, you and I, we're receiving that benefit every month, but over time, as just like in a mortgage, over time, your principal balance is paid down and the interest is less of that balance.
The payment. Yeah, it's exactly. Yeah.
So it works the same way for note investors. So how does it stay profitable for you to be a note investor with a performing loan over a long period of time?
No, it's a great question.
Yeah. How long do I keep this thing?
The way it stays, and some people some note investors will not buy loans that have, say, less than 100 payments left. something like that. So because you're right, you're getting more and more higher percentage of that payment each month is principal, right? So you're in a sense just getting your money back slowly. So why not just hold that in the beginning and not buy that note, right? The answer really is most performing loan buyers. So if you're a note investor and you really just buy performing notes, or even if you buy both, but you're targeting a performer right now, you have a particular yield that you will accept. And so that your performing note calculator should adjust based on the factors we just talked about. So short answer is you're buying that loan at a greater discount than you would for the same loan earlier in the amortization schedule. That said, that loan also has a stronger pay history, most likely. So if this note was, if there was a note that was just originated 2 months ago, yes, those payments are almost all interest, but there's not much of a pay history there. So there's a greater risk there because you don't know what this borrower is going to do, and even if there's equity in the property, you don't have a strong pay history. So at least when you're buying, more seasoned loans that have fewer payments remaining, you have a stronger pay history. We're assuming that. But there's more of a history of payments having been made. We don't know what that looks like in this hypothetical, but you're absolutely right. There's more principal coming back. So you build that into your numbers going in. So you should be able to get a loan that's closer to maturity at a greater discount because it's largely your own money coming back to you. So hopefully that answers that one.
How would someone who has a mortgage ever have their mortgage or a note not be held with the bank? Like, how could that even happen? Like, I think about my home and my mortgage, and it's like, well, how would my mortgage ever not be with the bank that it is right now? Like, why would someone find themselves in that situation? Does that inherently mean that it's not safe to invest in?
So, and I think in the last year or two, there's been a growing sector of borrowers that can't qualify for a traditional loan. So even though interest rates are super low right now, lending institutions make their own underwriting guidelines and for the most part, but they don't have to lend you money. So if you are deemed an unsafe borrower or just too risky for their guidelines, they're not going to lend you money. Or so you may be a self-employed individual who has really poor bookkeeping habits, or you have a really good accountant, so you're not able to show on your books that you make as much money as you actually do. And so there's a downside to that. Everybody wants to pay less in taxes, right? But then it's like, well, okay, show me as a bank, if I'm the bank, show me that you're able to afford this loan. Where's your income? I don't really have any income. Okay, well, you're not getting a loan. So, or maybe they fell on, hard times, or, bad things happen to good people, right? And also another whole sector of this is kind of mom and pop landlords. It can be hard to, it's one thing that I underestimated years ago when we got into rentals, is how challenging it could be to get a loan through an LLC. It's not super challenging, but it's harder than and the terms aren't as good, as compared to if I just walk in, even on an investment property that I own myself personally. You can get better terms and just better financing. There's more financing available for someone that owns a rental in their own personal name. So it could be mom and pop landlords who aren't able to qualify for a bank loan. So the whole world of non-institutional lending is seller financed, owner financed. So as an example, you know, we do have a condo that is a rental. We've had the same tenant in for 11 years. He's awesome. Boyd, if you listen to this, you're great. But he used to come to our house and drop off 6 months of checks twice a year, and pretty much we'd never hear from him. We were considering selling that to him as an owner financed transaction. He's getting up in age, and it probably just doesn't make sense for him to own at this point. So just, you know, he's happy just keeping it, you know, remaining a tenant. But we could have, or we still could, sell him this condo and then create a loan, whether it's ourselves or through an actual originator. And then we become the bank in that sense. So I wouldn't have nearly the same underwriting guidelines as a bank would, because I know him and I know he's good for it. So there are, you know, we just had the Justin Bogard episode released. You know, once this comes out, it will have been, you know, a month or so. But Justin plays in the owner finance space, right? So he doesn't even buy bank loans, bank originated loans. So the whole Eddie Speed world, owner finance, seller finance, that's a whole niche that I think is growing, frankly. That if you want to be a note investor, you're probably going to get a greater discount. Just to kind of circle back to part of your question, it's because the underwriting wasn't quite as strong as a bank's would be. And maybe the paperwork is kind of screwed up a little bit, you know, because it was just even if it was written, you know, through an attorney, that doesn't mean it's perfect. So you probably should get a greater discount if you're buying a performing seller financed note versus a bank note that, you know, is theoretically stronger.
And are there certain dollar amounts that you normally see notes for related to mortgages? Like, for example, let me phrase this a different way. So do you see notes for mortgages that are like $500,000 or $1 million? It's like, well, if someone has a $1 million mortgage, could you ever purchase a note on a $1 million mortgage, or is there more notes available for mortgages that are like $500,000 and less? Like,
right. So I don't target your state for first position for any mortgages. Just too expensive. It just, and then so you just don't see them. So it's definitely the kind of the world that we run in. Yeah, there's more between, say, even, I mean, you can buy a decent house in the Midwest for $100,000 still, even with property values going crazy. So we see notes more in the 25, and I'm talking principal balance, not purchase price per se, but $25,000 to 250 is a good kind of range. But honestly, it's more 25 to 100,000 is probably the majority of the notes that we buy. And yeah, I mean, the interest rates are higher, you know, and there's potentially more issues with them, and it makes that niche a little less passive, I guess. But yeah, you can absolutely buy loans that are $500,000 or more, but it's just there are fewer of them, and the discount is probably going to not be as good. So you're going to have to pay more for that loan relative to the principal balance, and the interest rate is going to be lower, most likely, because what bank is lending millions of dollars to a, you know, risky borrower? Certainly there are hedge funds and people out there who they want a 5% return on their money, and they don't, you know, but it's a pretty safe way to go. It's just not the world that we run in as note investors.
When you're looking at notes that are in that, like, let's say standard $25,000 to $100,000, that means that myself as a note investor, that would be my potential out of pocket that I'm paying to acquire that note. If it was just me and we're not doing any sort of like partial or split. So from an investment standpoint, if you're like, okay, I want to get into investing, but I don't want to purchase a mortgage on a home that's $200,000. Well, maybe I could put $20,000 into a note and have a higher interest rate there and start to receive that benefit every month.
Absolutely. And it is one of the downsides to note investing. It's pretty capital intensive, at least initially. You do need money from somewhere. And, in the beginning, and if you're going to scale, you need to find more money. And that's why a lot of note investors decide to go the fund route where they raise capital. But yeah, it's very difficult to walk into a bank and say, I want to buy this mortgage. So can you give me a loan to buy this loan? It's really challenging. So you can sell a partial or hypothecate, which is a loan against that loan. They're very similar, but that's after you've purchased the note, right? So you need that capital up front to buy the note. So yeah, it is one of those challenges, hurdles that people have to overcome if they want to become a note investor. But again, if you're buying rental properties, for example, you still need I know it's the whole no money down stuff. I still think it's a good idea to have some skin in the game, and if you can burr it and get all your capital back out, great. But I think if you're talking about investing, that means you have capital to work with, whatever asset class we're talking about. I mean, same thing with stocks. You need money to invest in stocks. So yeah, you do need some capital to buy that note.
And if you're going to begin, and let's say you have the capital, many times when you think about other investments, you think about the key players that would be on your team to make this investment successful. Like, for example, if you're going to invest in the stock market, maybe you have a trusted advisor that you work with. And then you have your contact at like Fidelity or wherever your money is parked that you can work with. So if you're a note investor, who are some of those key players that sort of make up your team?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. First one is a marketing rep. No,
I mean, we are the most important piece of the puzzle here.
No, it's funny. There are note investors who they don't market at all, and they like it that way, and they're successful. But sorry to take you down a couple notches there.
My pride.
So I will say, obviously, a newer note investor, brand new note investor, should certainly give this thought. And, it's a great question. That said, don't use it as an excuse not to get started, because things will change anyway. So your team is not set permanently. And so much of this varies by state. So it really does depend on where you're going to be buying your notes oftentimes, especially on the attorney side. But one other caveat, once you buy a note, it normally takes, say, 4 to 6 weeks for that to actually transfer to you. So this is not like a stock, where it's overnight. So you don't need all the answers right away. Some of this you're going to have to, I know Brandon Turner uses the analogy of driving in fog. It's like,
yes,
you don't see the entire road the whole time, but as you drive further, you see more of the road than you did, 20 yards prior. But so all my caveats are out of the way now. You need a servicer and a licensed servicer this gets back to your question you touched on a couple times, but the servicer collects your payments, and that's their primary function. They can do a lot of other things. Many servicers do many other things besides collect payments and send the payments to the lender or the note investor. That's their primary function. So you need a servicer.
So they're the servicer is the intermediary between the person that's making the payments and you.
Yes,
So
between the
that,
borrower and the lender.
yeah, so
Yeah.
that they're not knocking on your door every day and saying, oh, hey, here's your monthly payment.
No, correct. And so then they also prepare your tax forms, and hopefully their books are in order so that they can, give you accurate accounting records. So they are critical, right? And, Chris and I and Shante have our new servicing company, Bi-Fi Loan Servicing. We're not fully licensed in all states yet, or even the states we're planning to be licensed in, but I recommend people check us out. We're not fully functional yet, but we're excited for the future. But there are many other good servicers out there as well. So you do need a loan servicer. I recommend having a bookkeeper. We use Debbie Mullins. Now, some people do their own books. That's fine. But you should know what you're doing. You probably don't need, it can be yourself initially, right? So, but you should be thinking, if I'm going to scale, I should probably find a bookkeeper, or at least a CPA who's familiar with this, because note investing is different than other niches. And so I would say a servicer, a bookkeeper, an attorney. Now, when I say attorney, it's good to have an attorney, a sort of a business attorney in your own state that you reside in or that your business functions out of. And also start thinking about which attorney you might want to use, especially if you're dealing with non-performing loans where you think you're going to be heading to foreclosure, or even sending a demand letter, starting legal on that particular note. You're going to want a qualified and competent attorney in that particular state. And this is where it varies. I mean, an attorney who's great in Georgia today might not be great, or might, stop practicing, or, next year. So be ready to tweak your team members, but, that's a key one as well. So servicer, bookkeeper, attorney, and then you have all kinds of other vendors as well, like property preservation companies, things like that.
Is that a real estate attorney? Like, do they have to be a real estate attorney?
Yeah, I mean, they should be. Yeah.
And then you mentioned this a couple times, but do you recommend that newbies invest as themselves, or do you recommend that they start some sort of business, like they become an LLC or a corporation before they begin investing?
I find, I've started LLCs in like an hour online, and it's like, I don't think it's that challenging. It does add some complexity to your tax filings and things like that. And I don't mean that like I'm so smart or something, but we've got a bunch of LLCs, some for rentals, some for notes. Yeah, I mean, why not take that extra step and open your bank account with your LLC? You need your EIN. But it's not that many steps. So to me, you'll see these arguments about insurance versus LLCs. It's basically like CPAs versus attorneys. I don't know why you can't do both. So yes, if you're going to get into this, especially if you're buying land contracts, and we can save that for another episode, but CFDs, it's a whole separate animal. Especially if you're buying CFDs, your name is on the deed. I don't want my personal name on the deed. I just, for protection purposes, and I think it's just smart. So it depends on how many assets you're going to buy, depends on what your risk tolerance is. To me, the only assets we own that are not in LLCs or some business entity are owned in self-directed IRAs. I don't own any notes in my personal name.
Yeah, it seems like it would be not just more protection, but a little bit of a cleaner process as you want to scale and grow, because then you don't have to backtrack to try to move any of your investments into it. Eventually, if you're like, hey, I really want to actually treat this as a business now. And it's like, okay, well, how do I move everything that I had before now into this?
Yeah, I mean, you could do an assignment, but the other thing is, like, I don't want borrowers calling me personally. It's just creating that separation, not only from like a lawsuit standpoint, but also just a day-to-day kind of anonymity standpoint. I just personally feel more comfortable operating out of an LLC. And other people use trusts and they're different. It's not just LLCs, but I do recommend, again, not an attorney, but I recommend some kind of firewall there. And also just like, are you a professional or not? I don't, if you're,
No,
do you want as a
absolutely.
borrower, do you want to be receiving like statements as a borrower, receiving statements from your servicer with Katie Berlin as my lender, no offense. But
Yeah,
I
you're like,
just,
wait, but something about this corporation seems a little fishy.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's not that, I know California is more expensive. So I've sold partials, just as a quick aside. I've sold partials to someone in California, Eric Smith. He was on our podcast. And I don't know if, hopefully he doesn't mind me sharing this, but he got advice from his CPA that because he was going such the passive route, he makes good money from his his job. He's not a very active note investor, so he buys partials and things like that, but it didn't make sense for him to continually file and pay the $800+ a year it is in California for this LLC fee. It just didn't make any sense. So in that sense, okay, maybe, so we switched his over to his personal name, just an example. If you're going to get active in any way, shape, or form in this business, why not use an actual business entity?
On the idea of seeing your loan through all the way to the end, regardless if you're active or passive, we talked about exit strategies like a little bit.
Right.
But let's say that you finally get your funds. You're like, okay, I'm going to do this. You buy a partial. You're in it now. If it's me, let's say it's me.
Yeah.
I'm buying a partial. I put $20,000 into this $75,000 note that we had.
Yeah.
What happens next? Okay, so like I'm receiving my monthly payments, but then I'm like, okay, does this go on forever? Like, when does this end?
No, it's a set number of payments. If you're buying a partial, it's a set number of payments. And then, and I tell, for my partials, it's pretty boring. Like from your standpoint, ideally you're just getting a payment every month and that's it. That's the whole point, right? So it's not like a joint venture or like you buying your own note. So no, but it's all set ahead of time on a partial as far as the end date for you. And from my perspective, the person who bought the performing loan initially, you're not, because it's performing, really your only exit strategy is to sell it to another note investor or just wait for it to be paid off. Non-performing loans, that's where it's a whole separate animal of, you try to guess what your exit strategy is going to be when you purchase the loan, or at least, educated guess, but you don't know how it's going to turn out. But that's okay because you're comfortable with whatever exit we have to take. And ideally you mitigated the risk up front and purchased this at a decent price where you can still profit, whether it goes through the borrower or through the property, or if you just end up selling it. So yeah, it's the whole mix of different exit strategies, but there are many. It's more complicated on the non-performing side.
Well, I want to talk about that a little bit. So with the performing, just to like close this loop, then at the end of the day, the loan eventually gets paid off, and then there's no more loan,
Right.
in like an ideal world.
Mm-hmm.
But on non-performing, that in that situation, and we made the equivalency here of like a fix and flip is almost like a non-performing in this,
right.
If you're thinking about real estate world versus note investing world.
Yeah.
If you have not a non-performing loan and you're maybe a newbie and you have like passion for risk and you want something that
Yeah.
maybe keeps you up at night and you're like, yeah, let's add more spice to my life. Maybe this is the direction
Right.
I want to go. So if you decide to go that route, and let's say that you are well versed in this area, but you're like, all right, this is my first forte into non-performing.
Yep.
What are some of the tools and tactics that you use to determine, okay, how do I know if this is going to be a successful
Yeah.
investment, and how do I know what my exit strategies are?
Right. So one thing I will say is performing loans aren't always less risky than non-performing. So because of the discount you're getting on these non-performing loans. So, if in our $100,000 principal balance example, I might be able to buy that for $40,000 versus 75 or 90 on a performing. So right there, you've mitigated a good bit of risk because you paid a lot less for this deal. But you can get a sense when you're approaching a non-performing loan. You can get a sense based on history as to what much of it, almost all of this comes down to what the borrower is going to do. You can help educate them or, work with them. And that's one of the things, I like about this is trying to make these exits a win-win-win, win all the way around. So win for the borrower, win for the lender, win for if you're selling the loan for that person as well. But once you've done this for a little bit, you realize there are only so many exits that the deal could take, and you just have to be comfortable with that. But I think a key piece is communication, whether there's actual communication with the borrower or not. So when you're purchasing a loan, you should be able to get access to the pay history as well as the loan servicing comments. And so you can see the communication between the servicer and the borrower. And if there hasn't been any, it's more likely that you're going to exit through the property, meaning you're not going to, we have some loans in New York where we've tried, I just cannot get a response from the borrowers. We'll serve them with different options as far as a short payoff. And, I think this would be a whole separate episode as far as exit strategies for non-performing loans. But cash for keys is another one. And you'll hear about that. I mean, people are familiar with that on the rental side, where, look, I'm just paying you $1,000 to just give me the property, give me access to the property or give me the property back and we're good. Even though you owe me a lot more, we're good, right? So, and we've done that. We did cash for keys in Jacksonville, Florida. Now we have a strong rental property there. But you don't really know how it's going to exit, but you can kind of get a sense, okay, this person, there's communication. They clearly, they lost their job. Now they have a job again. And you can just see from the communication trail between the borrower and the servicer, or the borrower and the previous lender, kind of where you think it might go. Has the person filed for bankruptcy multiple times? Is there equity in the property? If there's a lot of equity in the property, the borrower knows that as well. And so there's a good chance they might file for bankruptcy. And so nowadays with market conditions, you're not seeing a lot of short sales and things like that because most people have equity in their homes right now. So it's a different, set of circumstances, but you can get a feel just based on the history of the note itself.
There is, though, another tool that you use on non-performing
Yes.
as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do approach performing loans with a performing calculator as far as creating our bid on that note itself. And then I use the IPA by Revival Brothers. It's the Ideal Project Analyzer to run our numbers for non-performers. And so and there are other products out there, but that's the one that I really like. It's Excel based, and it does allow for, you can run calculations through multiple exit strategies. It's up to 6 different exit strategies in the one calculator. Again, it's as soon as you put your numbers in, it's wrong. Okay, just to be clear, like you cannot predict exactly how this is going to go,
Right.
but you have to be okay with that, and with it, okay, if this goes to foreclosure, how's that going to look numbers wise? And this way, it costs money to buy this calculator, but you can save yourself a lot of money and heartache in the future if you're not overpaying for. It's just part of your pre-bid due diligence is running your numbers, and researching that property as best you can. So I use the IPA. I also enjoy a good New England IPA sometimes, but I use the IPA calculator by Revival Brothers, and so that's what we use.
It would seem like if you are unsure of the direction you want to go, just being able to look at the numbers and review them, like not to analysis paralysis level, but just being
Right.
able to review them and have that gut check gives you the extra courage. If you're having an IPA at the same time, it could give you liquid courage.
Liquid courage. There you
liquid
go.
courage plus financial courage to say like, okay, I'm gonna, venture into this space.
Yeah, and if you get into the arena where you're running a fund and you're bidding on 100, 200 loans at a time, I'm not going to sit here and say I've run every single bid through that calculator every time. But if you're a new note investor, I would not recommend bidding on assets, non-performing assets, without some kind of financial calculator. And I've seen this where, people are just bidding on 10 to 20 loans. They've never bought a note before, and they're not running any kind of numbers really. It's just, so you get into this sort of disagreement or split in the note space where it's like you bid on unpaid principal balance, a percentage of unpaid principal balance versus yield. And this is really in the weeds, but performing loans, you should bid based on yield, meaning what's your projected return going to be? But you should also see what percentage of your unprincipled balance you're bidding on, your bid is. And then on the non-performing side, I do both. The calculator does both. So it shows, how much of percentage of UPB as well as yield. It's harder to kind of, quantify that yield on a non-performer because there aren't payments. One more caveat I'll throw in there: a lot of notes do not fit in this either bucket neatly. So a lot of notes are sub-performers, or kind of performing but not really. There's a lot of gray in this space. So I do think having a strong calculator gives you, like you said, it does give you that confidence, and you can point to the math doesn't lie. it is what it is. Another thing with that particular calculator that I enjoy is you can save it as a PDF, and a one-page PDF, and send it to someone, maybe a joint venture partner or someone that you're potentially buying this loan with, and it kind of gives you a quick synopsis of the deal with picture of the property and things like that. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, it's pretty as well.
Helpful. Yes. For those who maybe do not live in Excel all day long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unlike marketers.
All right. Well, I think that in this, we covered a lot of ground. It's a lot of ground that we covered. It's helpful to understand the differences between performing, non-performing. We touched on the team that is helpful to have in place, the potential out of pocket that you're spending when you first dive in, how best to work with someone potentially. Like if you just want to get your feet wet, if you really need to have a business to go for this, or can you just maybe try one just in your own personal name if you're doing a partial, like your, reference Eric and the past guest that, that was his process. So I think that if I was a newbie, as a newbie, well, let me rephrase that. It seems less scary when you break it down, but I would think as a newbie for myself, definitely having something like tools like the calculator, understanding who I need on my team, and then partnering with someone would be the hand holding that I need to jump in. You
Yeah.
know, it's hard to part with a decent amount of money. You know, you're
Oh
just like,
yeah,
that's, yeah, it's
absolutely.
scary.
You'll also need a workflow management, asset management system. We use Note Rules, which is Podio based. Um, there are many other systems out there, but if you're going to buy more than a handful of notes, you're also going to need a system for tracking that. We didn't touch on that too much, but along with a calculator, which is more pre-bid due diligence, you're going to need some kind of asset management or tracking system to track all this if you're going to scale. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well.
And the Note Rules program that you mentioned is also linked on your site if somebody wanted to check that out.
Yes. Yeah. And in case Chris ends up listening to this, Chris also has a lot of resources on his 70investments.com website. I'm not the only one with resources out there. But yes, we have a link to the Note Rules as well as the IPA calculator and a lot of other free stuff, blog posts, YouTube channel, all kinds of stuff on labradorlending.com. Hopefully people can find some value there.
If you would leave a newbie with a note and bolt, what would you leave them with?
The one thing that comes to mind is there's always a tension between sort of the one extreme where it's paralysis by analysis, and then the other extreme where you're just throwing caution to the wind and not mitigating risk and not learning from others. So it never goes away entirely, but you have to find the right balance for yourself as far as when that, when you feel comfortable moving forward. Neither extreme is a good way to go, because if you never get in the game, if you want to be a note investor, but you never actually get in the game, there's a lot of risk there actually, because there's opportunity cost, and that you might have risk of regret. I never actually tried, but then the other extreme is not safe either. So my note and bold is to find that kind of happy medium where you feel comfortable moving forward, but just know that you'll never have it all figured out. And for me, it's just the fact that other people are doing it. Maybe I can do parts of that better in my mind anyway, but I don't have to reinvent the wheel. This person over here is doing this really well. Well, I can do that too. So I don't need to have it all figured out initially. So I don't know how many notes and bolts were in there, but
like Brandon Turner says, you just start driving and you see the next 5 feet, and don't let the entire process overwhelm you. Just, one little step at a time.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Jamie, thank you for allowing me to sit in this seat today to interview you. I appreciate it. Yeah, and
no problem.
Hopefully we brought some knowledge to the audience if, there's newbies out there like me that needed this little intro.
Absolutely. I think we covered a lot of ground. I mean, there's a ton of rabbit trails we could go down off of this episode, but I think we covered a lot. So thanks for filling in, and thanks for the really good questions.
Oh, yes. And we'll save all of those rabbit trails for future episodes. I'm sure that,
Perfect.
Maybe after once I take the plunge and I invest in my first note, then I'll be like, okay, let's have a,
now what?
Yeah, it'll be like this, this story that we follow along with.
Absolutely. Sounds like a plan.
Cool. All right.
And
well, thank you.
To the listeners out there, don't forget to go out and do some good deeds.
Oh, yes. All right.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.